Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is a fascinating rising South African star. His name is Wahbie Long. You may not know him, but I predict in the coming years you'll come to learn a lot more about him. He's an associate professor at the University of Cape Town. He's written a new book to try to explain us South Africans to ourselves. Wahbie, welcome.
Thanks, John, for having me on the show. Glad to be here.
Very good to have you. Now, your book is called Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind. But before we get into it, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, because reading your book, you have such a wide range of influences and such a deep range of influences. Tell us a bit about your background. Where did you grow up? I see you studied at the University of Cape Town, except for the clinical psychology at Stellenbosch, and then a doctorate at Cape Town and time in Harvard. But give us a bit about how you got into this.
Sure. Well, John, I'm born and bred in Cape Town. I grew up in Warmer Estate, then in Little Mowbray. I went to UCT for my undergrad and my honors, trained as a clinical psychologist at Stellenbosch, had a stint in the South African National Defence Force, in fact, was deployed briefly as a peacekeeper to the Darfur region of Sudan, came back, did a stint in a rehab facility, and then I joined UCT's Department of Psychology back in 2010, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. I would really, first of all, just amazed at the range of influences on you, from Frantz Fanon to Confucius to Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, all the way to the next door neighbor's German Shepherd and what that dog tells us about our society. So I want to move on to your book. Your book really, I think, is in many ways courageous, in many ways surprising. I want to start in the middle. In the middle of your book, you talk about South Africans being at an impasse. What is that impasse?
Well, John, the chapter on impasse is really, as I see it, about the dilemma facing many white South Africans. We live now in a democratic dispensation after centuries of first colonial and then a half century of apartheid rule. And I describe in this chapter on impasse the dilemma, the ambivalence, as I see it, that many white South Africans live with in terms of how to reinvent themselves in this new nation of ours. At the heart of this idea of impasse is the famous so-called master-slave dialectic, which of course is rapidly dissolving in post-apartheid South African life. And I argue that white South Africans, historically the masters in that dialectic, are having to reimagine themselves in quite fundamental ways.
Right. And you talk about it as, I mean, you see it as disorienting, obviously.
Yes, I do, because to step outside a dialectic of such as the master-slave one is, means in the context of South Africa to really consider yourself the equal of your fellow citizens. And I suggest that if one looks at the psychology of colonialism, that is not a straightforward task for many white South Africans, that in fact there will be this reluctance actually to step outside that dialectic, to try and reimagine oneself, to reconstellate one's interpersonal relationships in more equitable and socially just ways.
Yes. I mean, what interests me, because you talk about all parts of South African society, so with this white South Africans just come up first as it happens, but you don't stereotype people. I mean, you say there are plenty of there are white people who have adjusted and who really passionately wanted to see the end of apartheid. But you also talk about, you use the word not guilt, but guiltiness for a kind of those people who don't want to admit what they know is really true, that we were beneficiaries of apartheid. But we don't really want to face it. And so we say, no, I worked hard for where to get to where I am.
Yes. So what I try and do really, not just in that chapter, but in the whole book,
Yes,
is to really get people interested in history and to recognize that we are historical beings, that the past is with us. It's
yes.
with us in our present, and it influences our present, whether we want to admit as much or not. So that really is I think an important point in the book, that we often get very defensive when it comes to engaging with our past, which of course is typically or frequently how it goes down in psychotherapy, when you've just got one person on the couch rather than a nation. But again, if we are to move forward as a nation, whether that whatever one's position in South African society is, then we've got to take the past seriously. Um, the distinction between guiltiness and guilt is very important, John, because guiltiness really, as I write in the book, is a kind of, to quote one of the psychoanalysts that I draw on, it's an internal protection racket where you're not really engaging in any kind of um, moral reevaluation of your past. You're actually just withdrawing and retreating and not engaging. Um, so guiltiness is something that some white South Africans, I think, do engage in, but one's got to engage in a more mature and morally superior way, frankly, which is with the question of guilt.
And right, and on the other hand, you talk about the wound of apartheid that black South Africans still carry with them.
Absolutely. And let me also say, John, typically when one talks about apartheid and colonialism, one talks about the damage that has been done to colonized people, and in the case of South Africa, that's black people.
Right,
But in my book, I also try to drive home an argument that it's not only the colonized people who have been damaged by colonization, but the colonizer as well.
right.
One doesn't look into the abyss and not get affected. There are no clean getaways here, um, and so while it's not a popular argument to make, I think that colonization, apartheid rule has in fact cost us all, albeit in different ways.
Right. Now you talk about. I want to come in a little while to what you say about Cyril Ramaphosa and some of the politicians. But before we do that, I wanted to understand something about the universities. I've talked at the university from time to time at different universities. There seems to be an atmosphere that I don't really understand. Uh, Debate in the universities and among the students has changed very greatly since I was a student.
Yes, certainly. And in the chapter on envy, I really focus on, if you like, the intellectual climate in South African universities today.
Right,
John, I would say that traditionally universities are seen as marketplaces for the free exchange of ideas, and
right,
that argumentation and logical argumentation at that is the name of the game. But in the South African Academy, I think something different is going down. And perhaps I should also say, I don't think it's just in the South African Academy. I think it's taking over different parts of the Academy worldwide, where the
right,
focus is increasingly about not so much the universals of logical argumentation, but about the particulars of lived experience. There is a deep suspicion for grand theory and universal narratives, and I think a thoroughgoing embrace of lived experience as a valid approach to scholarship.
Right. We're going to have to take a break, but when we come back, I'm going to pursue this a little bit with you. You referred to the canon, in other words, the body of great writers and thinkers and learnings and books as something that many in the universities now write off as the wet dreams of dead white men. But we'll talk about that when we come back. And we're back talking to Wahbie Long, whose book is Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind. It's a fascinating and a fresh look at where we are today. It's full of things that will depress you, but maybe some that will give you a way through. Wahbie, just talk to me about this. This is what they call wokeness. A generation that is ripping up the script of how knowledge gets done.
So John, as I understand that wokeness really refers to the emergence of a particular reading of leftist politics. And it's a kind of politics that really is centered around identity, categories of identity, whether it be race, gender, or sexual orientation. And in the book, I refer to it as the race, sex, gender trinity.
Right.
And so in universities, what one will find, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, is that scholarship is really dominated by the race, sex, gender trinity. And it's an interesting development, and it's not just a South African one, it's an international one, which has been criticized by obviously the political right, but also I would say sections of the center, because yes, it is believed in at least by some people in the center and by many on the right, that there is a grievance culture, if you will, that dominates the identity politics of woke culture.
Yeah, you to give people an idea of what you're referring to, I'm going to quote from your book, because there's a passage where you quote from Inside Higher Education, where the editor starts a discussion by saying that he needs to describe himself as a queer, well, in fact, doesn't say he, the pronoun he prefers is they. So Eric Grolman says they are a queer, multiracial, black, white, and Jewish, middle-class, fat, spiritual, US-born, feminist, genderqueer man without disabilities. And that's how an academic discussion starts. Well, there's just one more. Someone describes themselves as from the life experiences of a culturally Jewish, agnostic, able-bodied, sex-positive, intersectional, feminist, and bisexual cisgender woman. And so it goes. And that leads to these, you refer to the examples of where discussions happen. There've got to be trigger warnings, safe spaces, preferred pronouns, lived experience, and other identity markers.
Right, and you know, when you mention all those identity markers that these academics use to introduce themselves, John, that really is about declaring one's positionality, as it were, before one even attempts to say anything in yes, a lecture space, because the understanding is that you have to give your audience, be it your students or fellow academics, the context. You have to declare where you're coming from so that they can appropriately judge your knowledge claims. Now, you can see here, or at least for my part, I worry about some of the dangers there, because what one quickly runs into is a situation where only Black academics can talk about Black people, or only female academics can talk about women.
Yes.
And so the list goes on. And one gets very quickly into a situation where the academy effectively gets balkanized, where it becomes impossible to engage in humanist discussions with each other, because there are all these divides that separate us from each other, and that make it impossible for us to speak across. So I take issue with this obsession with identity, because I see it as fundamentally anti-humanist. It makes it very difficult to speak along, to speak across social divisions, and I think it's a worrying development, because what happens in the academy does find its way into civil societies, public discourse, and although the ivory tower is not where the action is at, we do have to keep in mind that intellectual trends do become societal trends as well.
Right. Now, I mean, I know from reading your book that obviously you're not making light of the wounds, the deep, serious wounds that apartheid did cause to people in South
Absolutely, absolutely, John. One of the things that worries me, if you will, about this book is that, depending on where on the political spectrum the reader is,
Africa. Yes.
they are likely to interpret the contents of this book in accordance with their position on that spectrum.
Yes.
So of course, if someone were to ask me what are my values, I
Yes.
would say that I believe in the human family.
Right.
The universality of the human family. So I would describe myself as a humanist. But the fact of the matter is that we live in deeply ideological and polarizing times, and readers will make of this book what they will. I do think, though, that the book is difficult to place politically. Some will see it as drawing on identity politics. Others will see it as drawing on class politics. Some will see it as an apology for the status quo. And ultimately, I suppose, as it goes with all books, readers will have to make up their own minds.
Yes. Well, I must say that this is what appealed to me about the book, is that you draw on, as I said at the beginning, you draw on such a wide range, from Freud to Marx to Fanon to Confucius and to Ubuntu. So I think you're absorbing, in a way, you're a kind of a good interpreter for South Africa, because you're drawing on a very wide range. But I worry about what this is, and I mean, I know that what you said, just to get back to the universities, I know this is true in universities in America and elsewhere as well, but it seems to be particularly strong in South Africa. And I wonder what it is doing to what you refer to as the canon, the great writers, the great thinkers, intellectuals, and literature. Um, what is it doing to our education?
Well, John, I think that the canon must always be interrogated. So my
Sure.
own view is that the canon is not this timeless piece of wisdom that
Right.
is going to guide us
Right.
forevermore. It's always to be engaged with critically. My worry, however, is that because we are submerged in quite a, at times, regressive identity politics, that parts of the canon will get written off purely on the basis of the identity markers of writers and philosophers and poets and all the rest. So, for example, I teach a course in the Department of Psychology on philosophical and theoretical issues in psychology.
Right.
And one of the requirements I have of students is that they review a book on the history of psychology.
Right.
And I've heard it said with increasing frequency over the last 2, 3, 4 years by students that in their reviews they will make a comment along the lines of, this book is irrelevant because the writer is a white European male. And I find that kind of thinking really worrying.
On those grounds alone, I mean, in other words, you can say this guy's perspective is very limited and this is why, but to say just because of that identity, it can be dismissed.
Exactly. And that's the worrying thing, because if we are training our finest young minds to think like that, and I use scare quotes because it's not really thinking, then I worry for the future of the South African Academy. It's one thing to dismiss a book on the basis of its contents. It's another thing entirely to dismiss a book on the basis of who wrote it. And so what I always try to do with students is to have them engage seriously with the contents of arguments in canonical works. And if those arguments no longer hold water, then that should be the basis. That should be the basis on which a critique is offered.
But generally, not just in your own classes, but generally in UCT and other universities, do you feel the debate has the debate become more shallow, or is that just because I'm old and I remember things as better in the good old days?
Well, speaking for myself, I do find the debates frequently quite shallow and boring, John.
Yes.
I find that when I listen to students, not just in psychology, but from across the social sciences and humanities, whatever their discipline might be, I find that students are increasingly thinking in the same ways. Now, how is it possible that students from completely different disciplines can offer the identical arguments, can think in very similar ways, when the problems, the questions, the research methods of those disciplines are completely different to each other. So there's a kind of groupthink, if you will, if I may use the term, sure, that I worry is taking over the social sciences and humanities, certainly in South Africa, and it doesn't inspire confidence when you hear students from different disciplines talking the same language effectively.
We have to take a break. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Wahbie Long from the University of Cape Town. His new book is Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind. Wahbie, before we broke, we were talking about the state of the universities. And before I move on from that, there's a lot else I would like to raise with you. I see you have a quote on your cover from Jonathan Jansen, the former Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State, and now at Stellenbosch. I interviewed him on my show, and he said to me that he's seen the decline of all the non-South African universities, and he's worried about South African universities because he says when there are three elements in existence in a university, it's tickets. It's really pretty bad for the future. And the three are political interference, state underfunding, and chronic instability in the universities. And this was, of course, this was actually before President Ramaphosa took over, but he saw all three in South African universities. Do you have the same fear? Are you pessimistic?
I am pessimistic, and I share Jonathan Jansen's concerns, John. Yes. The other thing, if I may just broaden the terms of reference a bit, that concerns me is the state of our schools. The
Yes,
schools obviously are the feeders for our institutions of higher learning. And
yes,
you'll know that every year when the World Economic Forum does its surveys on the quality of maths and science education in the countries of the world, if South Africa isn't stone last, then it's pretty close to the bottom. And the 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 implications are disturbing, because what it means is that most of our young people not only cannot get into universities, but are functionally illiterate. That is to say, they are unemployable. So I worry about the fact that we talk so much about universities in this country. And granted, university life is important, certainly for economic growth, but we mustn't lose sight of the young people in this country who never make it into the inside of a university lecture hall, and that's most young South Africans. The unemployment rate for young South Africans, I think, is in the region of 60, if not 70%.
that's right.
And the quality of our schools is something that I think just doesn't get enough attention. And of course, in my argument around the appeal of decolonization discourse, I make direct reference to the fact that most of the young people that come into our universities are very underprepared for the demands of a tertiary education.
Yes. Now, this obviously leads us into the political sphere, and there was one thing you wrote in your book which I think needed could use a bit of further explanation. You were surprisingly harsh about Cyril Ramaphosa, and I think you lumped him in with Donald Trump. And you said, if I have you correctly, their moral hypocrisy is staggering and sickening. Have I got it right? And what did you mean?
For me, John, with Cyril Ramaphosa, I think he's a very interesting character, and I have seen some sort of psychological commentaries on his style of leadership. Many people
Right,
criticize him for dithering and for being a consensus seeker, and ultimately
right.
being indecisive. But there's an interesting psychological take on that kind of leadership, in the sense that
Yes,
he's not an impulsive president. He looks to reconcile contradictions, if you will, and there's a certain psychological, frankly, wisdom about that style of leadership. What I was disappointed with, though, was the, the that admission on his part of possibly being tainted as far as the donations went for his campaign, and
oh,
and 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 that really, it's not to say that we want to look for a godlike president that we can idealize, but it's very disappointing when one reads about these kinds of admissions, um, and that one in particular on President Ramaphosa's part.
yes. Well, of course, I mean, he was the deputy president all the time that state capture was occurring. And I think, I mean, I've often had colleagues who say, you know, that they can't forgive him for that. And what I say is, I've said to them is that's why he's a politician and we're not. I mean, I don't believe I could have, for as you know, lasted 5 minutes in that context, seeing that kind of corruption around me. But on the psychological point, I mean, he does remind me a lot of. You remember what was said of one of the greatest American presidents, Franklin Roosevelt? Someone said of him he was a second class mind, intellect, but a first class temperament. And I think that, you know, whether he was really a second class intellect is open to question, but the idea that the temperament is really the most important thing definitely does come to mind when you look at Cyril Ramaphosa, doesn't it?
Yes, And that comes back to the point I made earlier about him not being, um, uh, quick to act. He takes his time. He's calm and he's measured. Um, yes, you've got that uh, donations controversy that hangs over him, and of course, let's not forget about his involvement in the whole Marikana episode. So there certainly are there are disappointments that are
Right.
attached to the president. But in the same breath, he's a complex figure. He's not he's not easily pigeonholed in the way that someone
Yes.
like President Zuma is,
Yes.
for example.
Well, look, I think there's no doubt that Cyril is strategic. He's planning all these things. If you remember, there was a little iPhone clip of him just after he got elected at Nasrec, and he was normally when you've just been elected president of the ruling party and you're about to become president of the country, there'd be a little bit of backslapping or self-backslapping. And he said, no, this is just a beachhead. And of course, history has told us he's quite right, that the opposition to him is so strong all around that he knew this was only the first step in a long war, first battle in a long war. And I think there's no doubt he's very deliberate in his plans. I think there's still, this perhaps goes beyond this the subject at hand, but I think there's still a question to be asked about whether he really has clear understanding of what it would take to make South Africa a successful state. But his commitment to constitutionalism and working through it, slowly, steadily cleaning things up, I think that's proven.
I would agree. I certainly would agree, John. I was asked recently if I could put any three politicians on the couch, which would they be? And one
Yes,
of them, was Cyril, because I find him psychologically speaking, and of course I have absolutely no personal connection to the man. I find him fascinating. I find him compelling, and um, I think that I mean I certainly hope that he is able to steer the ship, the South African ship, into calmer and cleaner waters indeed.
right. So in your book, you refer to the shame, envy, and impasse before you get on to the more optimistic parts towards the end of the book. You see these as sort of driving emotions in South Africa. And I think it's part of your putting the nation on the couch. And you say that people who feel shame react by inflicting wounds. People who feel envy uh, react by being destructive, but they remain dependent. And then you say that people who feel that they're at an impasse feel they need to degrade the environment around them. Are you saying those are the dominant underlying emotions in South Africa?
Indeed, John, and of course, you'll know that with a country like South Africa, it's perhaps an exercise in futility to try and capture the complexities of such a divided and fractured nation as ours is.
Yes.
But really, those are the dominant emotions, according to my analysis: the shame of the poor and working classes, the envy of the rising black middle class, and the state of impasse in which many white South Africans find themselves. So, and that of course is representative of most of the nation. If one thinks of those three constituencies, of course, one can never do justice to the particulars, but I think that there are enough patterns, if you like, in South African life for it to be possible to give those kinds of or to make those kinds of broad brushstrokes.
Yes. Yes. I think you you've touched on a lot of things that people feel, and that's, I think, why the book is important. But um, in the last segment, we're going to talk about this slightly more optimistic frame that you can give to South Africa. But just before we go there, I mean, I'm very struck by, if you look at the quality of leadership that I experienced in politics on all sides, frankly, in the apartheid years. I mean, you look at the ANC leadership, Mandela, Sisulu, and Jordan, Becky, the people around them. I mean, they were impressive people, and frankly, so were the people, like Helen Suzman and so on, and even the early national apartheid leaders. I mean, to say they were stupid is just taking the easy way out.
Are you referring to the transition from apartheid to
Well, I'm saying
democracy,
that when
John?
you look at I guess what I'm thinking about, which we'll talk about in the next segment, is the quality of our leadership in South Africa politically. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa is perhaps an exception, and one of the reasons he seems to be reasonably secure despite everything is because nobody can think of anyone else better. Which is not to say that they really feel we're doing very well. But let me take a break, and when we come back for our final segment, I want to ask you more about that and what the way out, the psychological way out is that you have to offer. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Wahbie Long, author of Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind. Wahbie, just to finish on this, what I'm saying is that in all the political parties today, you don't see the kind of exceptional people that we saw in all the political spheres of South African government in the late apartheid era.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, John, and to try and figure out why that is the case, it would be a very complicated undertaking. I suppose on the one hand, I think about cadre redeployment. If you are not putting people in positions of power who are qualified to do the job, then you must expect problems. Not just later on down the line, but right now. And I think that is what has happened to some extent in South Africa. I also have those images of politicians fighting in parliament and throwing fists at each other
Right.
on national television. And of course it's very embarrassing to see those kinds of engagements in parliament. But I'm also reminded, John, of a line of thinking in, I suppose, international political studies, which goes something like this: that when the Berlin Wall fell and capitalism triumphed over communism, politics was no longer about great ideas, and that effectively since the late 1980s, early 1990s, not just in South Africa but internationally, there's just been a slow decline in the quality of political engagement, actually. And so perhaps some of that has filtered into South African political life, where we had these amazing leaders like Nelson Mandela, like Mbeki, Joe Slovo, and all the rest, Chris Hani. But as the decades have passed us by, political discourse has kind of degenerated, not just in South Africa, but around the world. So it's a complicated question, trying to understand what's happened. I think cadre redeployment is part of it. But then there's an international dimension to the issue as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Just coming back, because we're not going to have too much more time to what you're saying about South Africa. You do have you do have chapters called Hope and the Golden Rule towards the end to give us some sense that things could get better. Um, what is your way out of the impasse for South Africa? Where do you see hope, and do you believe in it?
Well, the first thing I think, John, that I have to say is that in the chapter on hope, I really look at the history of inequality as it has
Yes,
developed in the case of our species. And the argument I make is that inequality is the price we have paid for civilization itself. And that's
yes,
why Walter Benjamin goes as far as to say, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, that every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. Um, so the problem of inequality, let's not imagine that it's a special thing that takes on particularly harmful forms in modern society. It's always been with our species for as long as we've been civilized. Um, and I think that just contextualizing it, historicizing the problem, can take the heat out of it to some extent. Just to know that this is part of the problem, inequality. It's part of the problem of trying to live in a civilized way um, with each other. From there, I I I draw on the work of Walter Scheidel, the Stanford historian, and I make the point that the problem of inequality, unfortunately, ca cannot be dealt with unless a whole lot of people die. At least that's what the historical record appears to show. Whether it's world war, whether it's state failure, whether it is disease, um, or whether it's revolution, a lot of people have to die before inequality gets dented in a meaningful way. That's what the history books show us. Um,
Okay, let me challenge that because I mean I agree with you. There is a link to war and to a lot of destruction before inequality declined. But if you look at the 20th century, there are two, in my mind, two great reformers who narrowed inequality. And the first was Franklin Roosevelt, because from the days of Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s till close to 1980, when Ronald Reagan came in and the inequality widened considerably, for that entire period from the 30s to the late 70s, inequality in America declined. And then, of course, the other example I give is Deng Xiaoping of China, who brought hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty in China.
agreed, John. I mean, at least in the case of Roosevelt and the historical period that you're referring to, from the 30s to the 70s, we mustn't overlook what happened with World War II,
Yes,
with the kind of destruction and devastation and social leveling, really that that happened. That was really the setting out of which a more equal world order could be birthed. Although, of course, with the emergence of Reagan and Thatcher, um, those progressive developments were somewhat were seriously reversed.
yes.
So yes, I mean, certainly in the 20th century, we have been able to drag hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty. But we have to keep in mind the distinction between absolute poverty and relative poverty. Um, Absolute poverty, I don't think there can be any debate about that it has definitely decreased, but over the last century in particular. But when it comes to the question of relative inequality, relative poverty, i.e., inequality, that is a problem that appears to be frankly growing all the time.
Well, yeah, I would argue that there was a period. Well, not to spend too much time on it. I think that FDR was influenced by the First World War. I mean, the devastation of the First World War and the failure to correct things meant that by the time he took power, he had a vision that had been steeped in war. But and the gap between the rich and poor steadily narrowed. But anyway, let's move on to South Africa. You you in the end, out of all the misery of putting South Africa on a couch, you do see some way through. You do have a formula. You do have a way of thinking that you think South Africans should need to adopt if they're to profit from the pain of the past.
Yes, and it comes down to the problem of inequality, John.
Yes.
I cite many of the great world teachers from a range of ethical systems, be they agnostic, atheistic, or theistic. They all railed against the excesses of inequality, and they seem to have come up with a pretty general principle about how to deal with inequality. And in the book, I argue that it's actually quite a psychological principle, which has become known as the golden rule. And the golden rule is all about empathic immersion in the experiences of other people. In other words, imagining what it's like to be another person, um, trying to enter into their frame of reference, trying to treat other people as you want to be treated, and not treating other people in a way that you don't want to be treated. All of the great world teachers, whether it's Confucius, um, whether it's the Buddha, whether it's Jesus, the Hindu Upanishads, Islamic Sufism, Judah, they all have that same message about the golden rule. Now, of course, John, it's a very simple formula, right? Treat others as you want to be treated and don't treat them as you don't want to be treated. But it has proven incredibly difficult um, to actually give effect to in everyday life. And we just have to think about the violence in this country to see how far away from implementing anything like the golden rule we are as a nation. And that's why I argue in the book that we shouldn't try and therapize or psychologize our way to some kind of utopia. Um, all the book does is it tries to set out a psychological principle, a psychological way of being in the world. But that principle, which of course is the golden rule, has to go hand in hand with material changes. It's pointless just talking about treating each other well if material inequalities remain locked in place. The two have to proceed hand in hand, and that's why the land question is something that I regard as really of critical importance for the future of this country.
Well, Wahbie Long, I wish we could talk longer, but your book, Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind, is well worth a read. The cover, by this way, is fantastic. It shows the range that you bring to the discussion. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you, Wahbie, for being on the forum, and thank you for watching. Hope to see you next week. I'm John Matisonn.